I found my grandson shivering in the snow, while my family feasted inside behind locked doors. One kick changed their lives forever, but the fire I started revealed a betrayal deeper than I ever imagined. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The heavy oak door of my daughter's fortress didn't just open, it disintegrated under the heel of my work boot. I stepped over the splintered wood and into a room that smelled of rosemary and lies. My grandson Amos stood behind me, wrapped in my grease-stained winter coat, his lips a shade of blue that should only belong on a corpse. Inside, the air was 72 degrees and thick with the steam of a 20-pound turkey. My daughter Leona froze with a silver serving spoon halfway to her mouth, her green dress shimmering under the chandelier. Her husband Wilbur sat at the head of the table like a king, a carving knife gripped in a hand that had never known a day of real labor. The silence was so sharp it felt like it could draw blood. I looked at the crystal glasses and the fine china, then back at Amos, whose teeth were chattering with a rhythmic metallic clicking. They had been sitting here for 4 hours while a boy froze on the porch steps in 15-degree weather. My pulse thundered in my neck, a heavy factory beat that drowned out the cheerful holiday jazz playing on the hidden speakers. I didn't wait for an invitation. I didn't offer a greeting. I pointed a shaking finger at the man at the head of the table. "You have 30 seconds to explain why my grandson was dying on your doorstep while you passed the gravy," I said. My voice was low, vibrating with a rage that made the wine in Wilbur's glass ripple. Wilbur didn't flinch. He set the carving knife down with a slow, deliberate tap against the porcelain. He adjusted his silk tie and looked at me with the eyes of a man who owned the world and everyone in it. "This is a private family matter, Arthur," he said, his voice smooth as oil. The boy needed to learn about responsibility. He ruined the first bird. He needed to understand that actions have consequences. Responsibility? I stepped forward, my boots tracking slush across the white rug. "You locked an 18-year-old out in a blizzard over a burnt timer. That's not parenting, Wilbur. That's a felony." Leona finally moved, dropping the spoon. It hit the table with a wet thud, spattering gravy across the pristine cloth. "Dad, please," she whispered, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. "You're overreacting." Wilbur was just trying to give him some firm guidance. "Amos is fine." I turned on her, and for a second, I didn't see my daughter. I saw a stranger who had traded her son's safety for a seat at a rich man's table. "He's fine." I grabbed Amos's hand and pulled it forward into the light. The skin was waxy and white, the fingernails purple. "Look at him, Leona. Really look at him. If I hadn't shown up unannounced, you'd be calling a funeral home by dessert." Wilbur stood up then, using his height to try and crowd the room. He was 50 pounds heavier than me, fueled by gym memberships and expensive steak, but I had 40 years of lifting engine blocks in a Cincinnati plant. I didn't move an inch. "This is my house," Wilbur barked, his face flushing a dark, angry red. "My rules. Amos is my responsibility, and if you don't like how I run this home, you can find the hole you crawled out of and go back to it." The little girl at the table, Leona's younger daughter, started to sob. The sound pierced through the tension like a siren. Amos flinched, pulling my coat tighter around his shivering frame. "Grandpa, let's just go," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please. He'll only make it worse later." That was the trigger. The word later. It implied a history of shadows I hadn't been home to see. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, the screen glowing bright against the dim, high-contrast warmth of the dining room. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I opened the camera and took a flash photo of Wilbur standing over the feast, while Amos stood there looking like a refugee. "What are you doing?" Wilbur lunged, his hand reaching for the device. I stepped back, my thumb hovering over the send button to my lawyer and the local news tip line. "I'm documenting the crime scene, Wilbur, because we aren't just leaving, we're taking everything." I felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. This wasn't just a holiday gone wrong. This was a war for a boy's soul, and I was the only one left with the armor to fight it. Wilbur's eyes narrowed, his predatory confidence flickering for the first time as he realized I wasn't scared of his money or his house. "You take one more step," Wilbur hissed, "and I'll have you arrested for kidnapping and breaking and entering." I looked at the splintered door, then back at his smug, cruel face. "Call them," I said. "I'd love for the officers to see the bruises I just found on his jaw." The room went tomb quiet. I watched the blood drain from Wilbur's face, leaving it the color of old parchment. He glanced at Leona, but she was looking at the floor, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress so hard I thought it might tear. I didn't have to guess anymore. The bruises weren't a theory. I'd seen the way Amos moved, the way he guarded his ribs when I helped him into the coat. The evidence was written on his body in a language of purple and yellow marks that Leona had spent 3 years pretending she couldn't read. "Amos, go upstairs," I commanded. My voice left no room for argument. "Pack a bag. Everything you own that matters. We are not coming back." "Grandpa, I can't," Amos stammered, his eyes darting to Wilbur. "He has my documents, my birth certificate, my social security card. He keeps them in the safe in his office. He says I'm too irresponsible to hold on to them." I felt a fresh wave of heat rise behind my eyes. It wasn't just physical abuse, it was total, calculated control. Wilbur was building a cage out of paperwork and fear, making sure the boy could never truly run. I turned my gaze to the hallway leading to the back of the house. I knew where the office was. I'd seen Wilbur bragging about his mahogany desk during a previous visit. "You aren't going anywhere near my office," Wilbur said, moving to block the hallway. He picked up the carving knife again. He didn't point it at me, but he held it at his side, the blade catching the flickering candlelight. "You've caused enough damage for one day, old man. Get out before I make you." I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the one thing Wilbur valued more than power: his reputation. I turned my phone toward the window. My old Chevrolet was idling in the driveway, the exhaust plumes white and thick in the freezing air. "My neighbor is a retired Sergeant Wilbur. He knows I'm here. He has a copy of that photo I just took. If I don't call him in 5 minutes to say everything is fine, he's coming here with the sheriff's department." Wilbur hesitated. He was a man who lived for the country club and the HOA board. A domestic violence arrest would be the end of his social standing. I could see the gears turning, the cold calculation of a bully who had finally hit a wall he couldn't climb over. He looked at the knife in his hand, then at the crying girl, then at the shattered door. "Leona, talk to him," Wilbur shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of losing control. "Tell him he's ruining your life." Leona looked up, her eyes red and swimming with tears. "Dad, please. Wilbur is a good provider." "He's just stressed. Amos is difficult, you know how he is. He's always been sensitive." The betrayal felt like a physical blow to my ribs. This was the girl I'd raised, the girl who used to catch fireflies in jars and cry when they died. Now she was defending a monster while her son's breath hitched in the corner of the room. "You're talking about your son, Leona," I said, my voice heavy with grief. "You're talking about Martha's grandson. She'd be ashamed of this house. She'd be ashamed of you." Leona flinched as if I'd slapped her. The mention of her mother was a needle in her heart, but Wilbur wasn't done. He stepped toward me, his chest puffed out, the knife still gripped tight. "I don't care about your dead wife, and I don't care about your threats. This is my property. You have 10 seconds to leave before I defend it." I didn't back down. I moved toward him, closing the gap until the tip of that carving knife was inches from my flannel shirt. I could smell the wine and the expensive cologne on him. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. "Do it then, Wilbur," I challenged him. "Prove to your daughter and your guests what kind of man you really are. Strike an old man in front of your children." Wilbur's hand shook. He wasn't a warrior. He was a coward who used walls and locks to do his fighting. Behind him, Amos made a sudden break for the stairs. He moved with a desperate, frantic energy, his boots pounding on the hardwood as he fled toward the second floor. "Get back here," Wilbur screamed, turning away from me to chase the boy. I didn't think. I lunged forward and grabbed Wilbur by the shoulder, spinning him around. My grip was like iron from years of turning wrenches. I didn't punch him. I just held him there, pinned against the doorframe of the dining room. "You stay right here," I growled. The knife slipped from Wilbur's fingers and clattered onto the floor. He gasped, his eyes wide with shock as he realized my strength was real. Leona screamed, a high, thin sound that cut through the house. The little girl ran from the table, disappearing into the kitchen. From upstairs, I heard a heavy crash, the sound of a door being kicked in. Then silence, a long, terrifying silence that stretched until my ears rang. I held Wilbur pinned, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Amos," I shouted, my voice echoing up the stairwell. "Amos, answer me!" There was no reply, only the sound of the wind whistling through the shattered front door and the distant, mocking jingle of holiday music from the television. I shoved Wilbur back into the dining room, sending him stumbling into a chair. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I sprinted for the stairs, my old knees screaming with every step. I reached the landing and turned toward the back of the house where the office was. The door was hanging off its hinges, the frame splintered exactly like the front entrance. Inside, the room was a disaster. Books had been ripped from shelves, and the heavy mahogany desk was pushed aside. Amos was on the floor, huddled in front of a small wall-mounted safe. He had a heavy brass lamp in his hand, and he'd been using the base of it to bash at the keypad. His hands were bleeding, red smears staining the expensive wallpaper. "I got it, Grandpa," he panted, his eyes wild and unfocused. I got it open. He pulled a stack of papers from the safe, along with a thick envelope that crackled with the sound of cash. He didn't look at the money. He grabbed his birth certificate and his passport, clutching them to his chest like they were made of gold. I followed him, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We had the documents, but the house felt like it was closing in on us. I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Wilbur wasn't staying down. I grabbed Amos by the arm and pulled him toward the window. It was a long drop into the snow-covered bushes below, but it was better than the hallway. "We're going out the back," I said. Before we could move, Wilbur appeared in the doorway. He wasn't alone. He had a heavy black flashlight in one hand and a phone in the other. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was smiling, a cold, jagged expression that made my skin crawl. "I just called the precinct," Wilbur said, his voice eerily calm. "I told them there's a home invasion in progress. I told them an armed man is holding my stepson hostage. They're 2 minutes out." "You're lying," I said, but my gut twisted. Wilbur had friends in high places. He played golf with the captain. He knew how to spin a story until the truth was buried under a pile of legal jargon. Amos backed away from him, his heels hitting the windowsill. "He didn't mean it, Wilbur. He was just helping me." "Shut up, Amos," Wilbur snapped. "You're coming with me. Your mother is downstairs crying, and you're going to tell the officers exactly what this old man made you do. You're going to tell them he forced you into that truck." I stepped in front of my grandson, shielding him from the light of the flashlight. "He's not telling them anything, Wilbur, because we're leaving. Now." I turned to Amos and whispered, "Jump. Now. Aim for the drift." Amos didn't hesitate. He climbed onto the sill and disappeared into the white darkness. I followed a second later, the cold air hitting me like a wall. I hit the snow hard, a sharp pain shooting through my hip, but I scrambled to my feet. Amos was already running toward the truck, his silhouette a dark blur against the falling snow. Behind us, I heard Wilbur screaming from the window, his voice lost in the wind. We reached the Chevrolet just as a set of blue and red lights appeared at the end of the block. They were moving fast, the sirens muted by the heavy snowfall. I threw the truck into gear, the tires spinning on the ice for a terrifying second before they caught. We roared out of the driveway, the back end of the truck fishtailing wildly. I didn't head for the highway. I knew the main roads would be watched. I took a sharp left into a narrow alleyway, the branches of overgrown trees scraping against the roof. "Grandpa, they're coming," Amos choked out, looking through the rear window. I looked in the mirror. 2 cruisers were turning onto the street we'd just left. They hadn't seen us yet, but it was only a matter of time. The snow was coming down harder, a white curtain that was both our enemy and our only hope. I turned off the headlights, navigating by the dim glow of the street lamps and the memory of these roads from 30 years ago. "We've got to get to the interstate," I said. "If we can cross the county line, we might have a chance to breathe." But as I rounded the next corner, my heart stopped. A third police car was parked sideways across the road, its spotlights cutting through the dark. I slammed on the brakes, the truck sliding sideways toward a brick wall. We came to a halt inches from the barrier, the engine stalling out into a deafening silence. The officer stepped out of the car, his hand on his holster. He didn't draw his weapon, but he stood in the center of the road, his face obscured by the glare of the lights. "Exit the vehicle with your hands visible," the loudspeaker boomed. I looked at Amos. He was trembling so hard he couldn't even speak. He looked at the stack of papers in his lap, the documents he'd bled for, and I knew what he was thinking. This was the end. Wilbur had won. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I wasn't going to let that happen. I reached for the ignition, but then I saw something that changed everything. The officer wasn't looking at us. He was looking past us toward the house we'd just fled. The officer's radio crackled with a frantic, distorted voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pure panic. The cop in the road hesitated, his eyes darting between my truck and the glow of the neighborhood behind us. Then, without a word to us, he scrambled back into his cruiser, threw it into reverse, and roared past us toward Wilbur's house. "What happened?" Amos whispered, his face pressed against the glass. I didn't wait to find out. I cranked the engine, the old V8 roaring back to life, and I didn't head for the highway. I drove toward the glow. I know it was a risk, but I had to know. As we turned the corner, I saw it. Thick black smoke was billowing from the second-story window of the office. A fire had started, likely from the brass lamp Amos had used to smash the safe. The heavy curtains must have caught, and in that dry, expensive house, the flames were moving like a predatory animal. I saw Leona standing on the front lawn, her green dress a bright, tragic splash against the snow. She was holding her younger daughter, her face turned toward the sky. And there, on the porch, was Wilbur. He wasn't chasing us anymore. He was trying to run back inside, his arms full of boxes from the office. He was trying to save his money, his ledgers, his precious control. The roof groaned, a deep structural sound that vibrated through the ground. A second later, the front windows blown out, sending a shower of glass across the driveway. The heat was so intense, I could feel it through the windshield of the truck. "Grandpa, we have to help them," Amos said, his voice small and terrified. I looked at the house, the monument to Wilbur's cruelty, and I saw the flashing lights of the fire trucks arriving. They didn't need me, but Leona did. I pulled the truck to the curb 50 yards away. I told Amos to stay put, and I stepped out into the cold. The air tasted like scorched mahogany and plastic. I reached Leona just as she collapsed into the snow. She wasn't injured, just broken. She looked up at me, and for the first time in years, the mask was gone. The suburban perfection, the expensive dress, the practiced excuses, it had all burned away. "He wouldn't come out," she sobbed, clutching my arm. "He went back for the safe. He wouldn't leave the money." I looked at the porch. The fire department was dragging a hose toward the door, but the entryway was a wall of orange flame. Wilbur appeared at the window of the second floor, his face pressed against the glass. He was screaming, his hands clawing at the frame, but the heat had warped the metal. He was trapped in the very cage he'd built. I felt a moment of pure dark justice, but then I saw the terror in his eyes. He was a monster, yes, but he was a man, and no one deserves to go like that. I started toward the house, but a fireman grabbed me by the shoulder, spinning me back. "Get back, old man. It's gonna go." The roof caved in with a roar that sounded like a jet engine. The second floor vanished into a fountain of sparks. The screaming stopped. I stood there for a long time, the heat of the fire on my face and the cold of the snow on my back. Leona was still crying, a jagged, hollow sound. I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. Not yet. I just watched until the flames were nothing but a dull red glow, and the walls of the house were black skeletons against the Cincinnati sky. I walked back to the truck. Amos was waiting, his face wet with tears. He'd seen it all. He didn't ask if Wilbur made it. He knew. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door, shutting out the sound of the sirens and the crackling wood. "Where do we go now?" Amos asked. "We're going home," I said, "to the house your grandmother loved." I put the truck in gear and drove away. We passed the police cruisers, but they didn't stop us. They were too busy with the wreckage. We crossed the county line as the sun started to peek over the horizon, a pale gray light that revealed the world was still turning. But as we pulled onto the gravel driveway of my small, modest ranch, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. Just 4 words that made the hair on my arm stand up. The safe was empty. The engine of the Chevrolet ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the quiet morning. I stared at the phone screen, the text glowing like a coal. I looked at Amos. He was clutching the envelope he'd taken from the office, the one I'd assumed was full of cash. He hadn't opened it. He'd been too busy shaking. "Amos, give me the envelope," I said. My voice was steady, but my hands were trembling. He handed it over without a word. I tore the top off and reached inside. There was no money. There were photos. Dozens of them. They weren't from family vacations or holiday dinners. They were surveillance shots. They showed me at the grocery store. They showed me at Martha's grave. They showed Leona at the library, but the last one was the worst. It was a photo of the safe in the office, taken from the inside, and sitting on the velvet lining was a single handwritten note. "I knew you'd come for him, Arthur. Happy Thanksgiving." I felt the blood go cold in my veins, the fire, the trap. Wilbur hadn't been caught off guard. He'd been waiting for this. He'd orchestrated the confrontation, the lockout, the whole nightmare. He wanted me to break in. He wanted the house to burn. "Grandpa?" Amos asked, his voice trembling. "What is it?" I didn't answer. I looked at the text again. The safe was empty. If Wilbur was dead in the house, who sent the message? I looked at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those blue and red lights again, but the road was empty. The silence of the woods felt heavy, like a lung full of water. "We aren't safe here," I said, throwing the envelope onto the dashboard. I restarted the truck, the engine groaning in the cold. We didn't go inside. I backed out of the driveway and headed toward the one place I knew Wilbur's influence couldn't reach. My brother's cabin in the hills, 2 hours south. It was off the grid, no phone lines, no neighbors. As we drove, the pieces started to click together. Wilbur had been in debt, deep debt. I'd heard rumors about his business failing, about the offshore accounts. The house was insured for 3 times its value. He didn't die in that fire. He couldn't have. He'd used the chaos to vanish, to take the insurance money and leave his family in the ashes. And he'd used me to do it. I was the home invader. I was the one who kicked in the door. I was the one who provided the excuse for the fire. I had played my part in his script perfectly. I looked at the road ahead, the asphalt black and slick with melted snow. My jaw was set so tight my teeth ached. He'd hurt my grandson, he'd destroyed my daughter's home, and then he'd used me as his fall guy. He thought he was the architect of this story. He thought he could walk away into a new life while I spent the rest of mine in a cell or on the run. "He's wrong," I whispered. "About what?" Amos asked. "About me," I said. "He forgot that I spent 40 years building machines that don't break, and I'm not going to break now." I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a rag. It was a spare key to a safety deposit box Martha had kept in secret. She'd told me once, if the world ever ends, go here. I'd never asked why. I'd never needed to. Until now. We reached the cabin as the first real snowstorm of the season began to howl. The trees were bending under the weight of the wind, and the sky was a bruised purple. I parked the truck under a lean-to and led Amos inside. The air in the cabin was ice cold, smelling of pine and old newspaper. I lit a fire in the hearth, the flames licking at the dry logs. Amos sat on the floor, his back against the stone, his eyes wide and vacant. He was in shock, the reality of the night finally sinking in. "Listen to me, Amos," I said, kneeling in front of him. "We are going to find him. Not for the money. Not for the house. for you. Because no one treats a member of this family like garbage and gets away with it." Amos looked up, and for the first time since I'd found him on those steps, I saw a spark of something other than fear. I saw the Burke blood. I saw the fire that had kept me alive in the factories and kept Martha strong through the cancer. "What do we do?" he asked. I stood up and looked at the safety deposit key. "First, we find out what your grandmother was hiding. Then, we hunt." I turned toward the window as a shadow crossed the porch. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and moved toward the door. The wood creaked, a slow, deliberate sound. Someone was out there, standing in the storm, waiting for the fire to die down. I threw the door open, ready to swing, but the person on the porch didn't move. It was Leona. She was covered in soot, her green dress shredded, her eyes wild with a terror I'd never seen before. "He's not dead, Dad," she choked out. "He's coming for us." The floorboards of the cabin didn't just creak, they groaned under the weight of Leona's collapse. I caught her before her knees hit the pine, her skin feeling like parchment dipped in ice water. She was shaking with a rhythmic, violent tremor that made her teeth click, the same sound Amos had made on the porch. I hauled her toward the fire, the orange light dancing in her wide, blown-out pupils. "He was in the garden," she rasped, her voice a dry hinge. "After the roof fell. I saw him in the shadows of the oaks. He wasn't burned, Dad. He was just watching. He had a bag. He looked at me, and he didn't even blink." I felt the air in my lungs turn to lead. My daughter was a shell. Her green dress, once a symbol of Wilbur's status, now a blackened rag clinging to her shivering frame. I looked at Amos. He had backed into the corner, his hands knotted in the blanket I'd given him. The hope I'd seen an hour ago had vanished, replaced by the suffocating realization that the monster was still breathing. "Where did he go, Leona?" I asked, my voice a low factory rumble. "He took the sedan," she whispered. "He didn't come for me. He didn't even look for our daughter. He just went to the trunk, grabbed something, and drove toward the old quarry road." The quarry. It was a dead end, a jagged scar in the earth used by local crews for illegal dumping. If he was there, he wasn't hiding. He was meeting someone. I looked at the safety deposit key on the mantel. Martha had been a quiet woman, a woman of hymns and lavender, but she had seen the rot in Wilbur long before I did. She had left me a weapon, and I was done waiting to wield it. "Leona, stay here," I commanded, grabbing my heavy work jacket. "Bolt the door. If anyone but me knocks, you use the iron poker." "Grandpa, no!" Amos lunged forward, grabbing my sleeve. "He'll kill you. He's younger and he has people." I gripped the boy's shoulder, my hand steady as a vice. "He has people, Amos. But I have you. And I have the truth. And in this county, that's still worth a hell of a lot more than a silk tie and a lying tongue." I stepped out into the storm. The wind was a physical weight, pushing against my chest as I climbed into the Chevrolet. The engine turned over with a defiant growl, the headlights cutting 2 yellow tunnels into the swirling white. I drove with a purpose I hadn't felt since the day I retired. I wasn't an old man anymore. I was a machine built for one final heavy task. The quarry road was a sheet of black ice. I saw the taillights of the sedan half a mile ahead, 2 red eyes mocking me in the dark. Wilbur was driving like a man with nothing to lose, his tires kicking up plumes of slush. I pushed the Chevy to 60, the frame rattling, my knuckles white on the wheel. He pulled over near the edge of the pit, where the ground dropped 200 feet into the frozen slush below. I slammed the truck into park and stepped out before the engine had even stopped vibrating. Wilbur was standing by his open trunk, tossing stacks of ledgers into a small fire he'd started in a metal drum. "You're late, Arthur," Wilbur said, not turning around. "I expected you at the cabin 10 minutes ago. Did Leona slow you down?" She always was a drag on the pace. I walked toward him, the snow crunching under my boots like breaking bone. The fire in the drum hissed as a wet ledger hit the flames. "You burned your own house, Wilbur. You almost killed your family for a tax dodge." "I saved my life," Wilbur corrected, finally turning to face me. "That house was a tomb. The debt was a mountain. Now I'm a tragic widower with a massive insurance payout and a clean slate. You aren't a widower, I said, stepping into the light of his fire. Leona is at the cabin, and she's talking. Wilbur's face contorted, the mask of the successful businessman finally shattering into something jagged and predatory. Then she's a liability, he spat, and liabilities get liquidated. He reached into the trunk and pulled out a heavy black tire iron. He didn't look like a golfer anymore. He looked like the monster Amos had described in the dark of the garage. He lunged, the metal whistling through the frozen air. I didn't dodge. I moved inside his reach, my forearm taking the blow with a dull thud that went straight to the bone. I didn't feel the pain. I felt the 40 years of factory steel in my soul. I grabbed his throat with my free hand and slammed him back against the sedan. The fire in the drum roared as the wind caught it, casting long, monstrous shadows across the quarry floor. Wilbur clawed at my hand, his eyes bulging, his face turning the same purple as the bruises on my grandson. "This is for Amos," I growled, my voice a rasp of gravel. I threw him toward the edge of the pit. He stumbled, his expensive leather loafers slipping on the ice. He teetered there for a second, a man made of paper and lies, staring down into the dark. He didn't fall. He caught a rusted guardrail, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. He looked at me, and for the first time, he wasn't a king. He was a rat in a corner. "Help me, Arthur," he shrieked. "I'll give you the money. Half the insurance. $2 million. Think of Amos's college." I looked at the hand reaching for me, the same hand that had locked a boy out to freeze. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't take his hand. I hit the speakerphone. "Did you get all that, Sheriff?" I asked. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire drum and the distant, lonely howl of a siren. From the phone in my hand, a voice came through, deep, tired, and official. "We got it, Arthur," the sheriff said. "We've been recording since you left the cabin. Stay where you are. We're coming up the ridge." Wilbur's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. He let go of the guardrail and collapsed onto the ice, his expensive coat soaking up the slush. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a heap of broken pride. "You trapped me," he whispered, his voice trembling like a child's. "You used the boy to trap me." "I used the truth, Wilbur," I said, standing over him. "You're the one who provided the rope." The cruisers swarmed the quarry, their spotlights turning the snow into a blinding white stage. Officers moved in with the mechanical precision of a line at the plant, their boots crunching in unison. They didn't treat him like a businessman. They treated him like a dog. They hauled him up, the handcuffs snapping shut with a finality that echoed off the quarry walls. As they led him away, Wilbur turned his head, his eyes searching for me in the glare. "You'll never see a dime, Arthur," he screamed. "I'll tie this up in court for 10 years. You'll die in that shack before you see justice." I didn't answer him. I watched the taillights of the lead cruiser disappear over the ridge. The quarry went quiet again, leaving me alone with the fire drum and the ghosts of the night. I walked to his sedan and reached into the open trunk. Underneath the spare tire, I found it, a heavy, waterproof case. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. It wasn't just money. It was the ledgers Wilbur had failed to burn, the proof of 3 years of systematic theft from his own company and his wife's inheritance. I drove back to the cabin, the heater in the Chevy finally winning the war against the cold. When I pulled into the yard, the porch light was on, a small amber beacon in the storm. Amos was waiting at the door, the iron poker still in his hand. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice steady for the first time. "It's just beginning," I said, handing him the waterproof case. We sat by the fire for the rest of the night, the 3 of us. Leona had cleaned the soot from her face, her eyes tired but clear. We didn't talk about the fire or the quarry. We talked about Martha. We talked about the garden we were going to plant in the spring. I pulled the safety deposit key from my pocket and set it on the table. "Tomorrow we go to the bank," I said. "Your grandmother knew this day was coming, Amos. She didn't leave us money. She left us a map." "A map to what?" Leona asked, her voice hushed. "A map to the life Wilbur tried to steal," I said. I looked at my grandson. The blue was gone from his lips, replaced by a healthy, stubborn red. He looked at the case in his lap, then at me. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a man who had just inherited a kingdom he finally knew how to defend. But as the clock on the mantel struck 4 in the morning, a heavy rhythmic thudding started on the roof. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the snow. It was a rhythmic mechanical beating that made the windows rattle in their frames. I stood up, my pulse spiking. I grabbed the iron poker, but the front door didn't break. It opened slowly, without a sound. Standing there, framed by the white chaos of the storm, was a man in a black tactical vest, a badge gleaming on his chest. "Mr. Burke," he asked, his voice like cold steel, "you need to come with us. There's something we found at the quarry that wasn't on the recording." The ride back to the station was a blur of high-contrast lights and the low hum of the cruiser's heater. The officer, a man labeled only as lead investigator, didn't speak a word. I sat in the back, the heavy waterproof case on my lap, feeling the weight of every year I'd ever lived. Amos and Leona were in the car behind us, their faces pale ghosts in the rearview mirror. We didn't go to the main entrance. We went to the basement, through a door that required 3 different key cards. The room they led us into was sterile, white-tiled, and smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner. On a long steel table sat the remnants of Wilbur's fire drum. "What is this?" I asked, my voice echoing in the cold space. The investigator pointed to a charred metallic object sitting next to the drum. It was a second safe, smaller, older, and encrusted with the muck of the quarry floor. "We found this 30 feet from the car," the investigator said. "It wasn't Wilbur's. The serial number traces back to a residence in Cincinnati. Your old address, Mr. Burke. The one you shared with your wife?" I felt the room tilt. That safe had been missing since the day Martha died. I'd searched the basement for a month, thinking I'd lost it in the grief. Wilbur hadn't just stolen Amos's future. He'd robbed my past while I was too busy mourning to notice. "Open it," I said, my voice a jagged rasp. The investigator used a hydraulic spreader. The metal gave way with a scream that sounded like a dying animal. Inside, protected by a layer of fireproof silk, was a leather-bound journal and a single heavy gold coin. I reached for the journal. The handwriting was Martha's, clean, elegant, and unwavering. I flipped to the last page. The date marked only 3 days before her final breath. "Arthur," the ink read, "Wilbur is not who he says he is. He's been using the plant's pension fund to cover his losses. I have the account numbers. I have the signatures. If you are reading this, I am gone, and the boy is in danger. Do not trust the lawyers. Trust the basement." I looked at the coin. It wasn't currency. It was a commemorative token from the plant, given to the master mechanics who had served 40 years. I turned it over in my hand. There, etched into the rim, was a series of numbers. "The account codes," I whispered. The investigator leaned in, his face tight. "Mr. Burke, if these numbers are what I think they are, Wilbur didn't just burn his house for insurance. He burned it to destroy the evidence of a $250,000 embezzlement scheme that reaches all the way to the state capitol. The stakes hadn't just climbed the ladder, they'd jumped off the roof. This wasn't a family fight anymore. This was a public execution of a criminal empire." I looked through the glass partition into the waiting room. Amos was sitting there, his head in his hands. He didn't know yet that he was the key to bringing down the man who had tried to freeze him out of existence. "We need your testimony, Arthur," the investigator said, his hand on the journal. "If you sign this affidavit, Wilbur goes away for life." No country club, no parole, just a concrete box and a numbered jumpsuit. I picked up the pen. The ink flowed black and thick, the same color as the quarry fire. I signed my name with a flourish that felt like a hammer blow. But as I handed the paper back, the lights in the room flickered. A low, rhythmic thudding started in the walls, the sound of the building's generator failing. The investigator's radio exploded with static. "Breach at the perimeter," a voice screamed. "Multiple vehicles on the lawn. They're not police." The room went pitch black. I felt a hand grab my collar, pulling me toward the floor. "Stay down, Arthur!" the investigator hissed. A window shattered above us, glass raining down like ice. I heard the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of boots on the tile. Too many, too fast. They weren't here for Wilbur. They were here for the journal. I gripped the gold coin in my pocket, the metal biting into my palm. In the dark, I could hear Amos screaming my name from the other side of the glass. "Grandpa!" The sound of a heavy door being kicked open echoed through the hall, followed by a flash of light that turned the world white. The white light wasn't a muzzle flash. It was the high-intensity beam of a tactical strobe, turning the basement into a stuttering, high-contrast nightmare. I rolled behind the steel table, the cold metal pressing against my spine. Shadows danced on the walls, tall, jagged shapes moving with the predatory grace of hired muscle. "The journal," a voice barked, muffled by a respirator. "Secure the book and the old man." I didn't have a gun. I didn't have a badge, but I had 40 years of knowing how things broke. I reached under the table and found the gas line for the industrial heaters. With a single violent twist of my wrist, I snapped the valve. The hiss of escaping gas filled the room, a sharp chemical sting that made my eyes water. "Nobody moves," I roared, my voice a factory floor command. One spark, and we all go to see Martha together. The strobe light froze. I could see them now. 3 men in gray tactical gear, their weapons leveled at my chest. They weren't Wilbur's friends. They were the people Wilbur owed. They were the high-level pressure he'd been trying to outrun. "You're bluffing," the lead man said, his voice a distorted rasp. "You won't kill yourself over a pile of paper." I pulled the lighter from my pocket, the one I'd used to start the fire in the cabin. I flicked the wheel. The flame was a tiny, defiant orange spark in the dark. "Try me," I said, echoing the words I'd given Wilbur in the dining room. "I've lived my life. I'm just making sure Amos gets to start his." The men hesitated. In that pause, the basement door exploded inward. It wasn't the police. It was the sheriff, leading a team of deputies with the fury of a man whose town had been invaded. The room erupted into a chaos of shouting and slamming bodies. I stayed low, the gas still hissing, until a hand grabbed my arm and hauled me toward the exit. It was Amos. He wasn't shaking anymore. He had a fire extinguisher in one hand and a look of absolute cold-blooded resolve in his eyes. "I got you, Grandpa," he said, his voice deep and sure. We burst through the doors into the freezing morning air. The storm had passed, leaving the world a pristine, silent white. The tactical team was being loaded into vans, their power stripped by the very documents Martha had hidden in the basement. Leona was waiting by the Chevy, her face illuminated by the rising sun. She didn't look like a suburban socialite. She looked like a Burke. She walked to me and pulled me into a hug that smelled of lavender and wood smoke. "It's over, Dad," she whispered. "The accounts are frozen. The lawyers are talking. Wilbur is never coming back." I looked at my grandson. He was standing by the truck, the gold coin catching the first rays of light. He wasn't the boy who had shivered in 15-degree weather. He was the man who was going to build something better. 4 months later, the garden at the ranch was starting to bloom. We had planted the seeds in the rich, dark earth where Martha's lavender used to grow. Amos sat on the porch, his guitar leaning against his chair, a stack of engineering textbooks open on his lap. "Grandpa, check this out," he said, holding up a letter. "The state is releasing the frozen funds. The plant's pension is restored. Everyone gets their money back." I sat down next to him, the sun warming my old bones. $12,500 was sitting in a new account for his first semester. It wasn't just a number. It was a wall against the cold. "Your grandmother would have loved this," I said, looking at the vibrant green of the new sprouts. Amos smiled, a real, easy expression that reached his eyes. "She's here, Grandpa." She never left. I looked at the gate at the end of the driveway. It was the same gate I'd driven through in a panic on Thanksgiving Day, but today it was wide open. A neighbor waved as they drove by, and I waved back. We had lost the house in Cincinnati, and we had lost the illusion of a perfect family. But we had found something harder, something made of factory steel and honest ink. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The air was 72 degrees, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving. I was home. I felt a small, heavy weight in my pocket, the gold coin. I didn't need it to unlock any more secrets. I just liked the way it felt. Solid, real, and finally, perfectly quiet. Would you like me to create a summary of the character arcs or a list of the final legal consequences for the antagonist? If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you are here.